China's holdings of U.S. Treasuries skid to 12-year low. Japan also cuts holdings. New York. China's holdings of U.S. Treasuries tumbled in April to their lowest in view that May 2010, records confirmed on Wednesday, with Chinese investors probable cutting losses as Treasury fees fell after Federal Reserve officials signaled vast rate hikes to mood soaring inflation. Chinese holdings dropped to $1.003 trillion in April, down $36.2 billion from $1.039 trillion the previous month, consistent with U.S. Treasury Department figures. China's inventory of treasuries in May 2010 was $843.7 billion, records confirmed. The discount in Treasury holdings might also have been aimed toward diversifying China's forex holdings, analysts stated. The Chinese sales contributed to a drop in standard foreign holdings of treasuries in April that helped propel yields better. U.S. benchmark 10-year Treasury yields started out April with a yield of 2.3895%, and surged kind of 55 basis points to 2.9375% with the aid of the stop of the month. Japan's holdings of U.S. Treasuries fell further in April to their lowest because January 2020, amid a persistent decline within the yen as opposed to the dollar, which may also have induced Japanese traders to sell U.S. property to enjoy the alternate fee. Japanese holdings fell to $1.218 trillion in April, from $1.232 trillion in March. Japan remained the biggest non-U.S. holder of treasuries. Overall, overseas holdings of treasuries slid to $7.455 trillion, the bottom considering April 2021, from $7.613 trillion in March. On a transaction foundation, U.S. Treasuries noticed net overseas outflows of $1.152 billion in April, from internet new overseas inflows of $48.795 billion in March. This became the first outflow on account that October 2021. The Federal Reserve, at its coverage meeting in March, raised benchmark hobby costs by means of a 0.25% factor. It lifted prices with the aid of 50 bits per second in May, but at the June policy meeting on Wednesday lifted rates via a hefty 75 bits per second to stem a disruptive surge in inflation. The Fed also projected a slowing economic system and rising unemployment inside the months to come. In other asset instructions, foreigners sold U.S. equities in April amounting to $7.1 billion, from internet outflows of $94.338 billion in March, the biggest considering the fact that at least January 1978, when the Treasury Department began keeping music of this statistics. Foreign buyers have sold stocks for 4 consecutive months. U.S. corporate bonds, on the other hand, posted inflows in April of $22.587 billion, from March's $33.38 billion, the largest for the reason that March 2021. Foreigners have been internet shoppers of U.S. company bonds for 4 immediately months. U.S. citizens, meanwhile, reduced their holdings of long-term overseas securities, with net income of $36.7 billion, records confirmed.